Welcome to Frankly Speaking, the podcast on responsible business from Frank Bold, the European public interest law firm. I'm Richard Howitt, and after many years leading debates on responsible business in the European Parliament, I host our discussions about the very latest developments in corporate sustainability, sustainable finance, business and human rights. Today, the US Corporate Human Rights Index just published a new initiative to track the human rights policies and commitments of 54 major US companies across 5 high-risk sectors. Their report neatly sums up the dilemma facing US companies in its title, Retreat or Respect. Joining us to discuss this is one of the prime movers of the initiative, an old friend of this podcast, Bennett Freeman, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights and Labour in the Clinton administration, and someone who has been behind many of the major developments in responsible business over the years, including the Voluntary Security Principles, the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, the Global Network Initiative, and now Business for Ukraine. Welcome, Bennett.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to join you again.
And also joining us from Washington is Chloe Cole, Senior Researcher responsible for the initiative at the newly renamed Business and Human Rights Centre. Chloe has a long history working in business and human rights in government, in NGOs and in academia. Welcome, Chloe.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Now, Bennett first, quite simply, what is your intent in doing this?
You know, Richard, we've seen progress, significant progress in the business and human rights world over the last quarter century on both sides of the Atlantic and indeed around the world, and including in the United States. That progress has been significant, positive overall, of course, also inconsistent, incomplete, and in places and at times, frankly, inadequate. But nonetheless, there is now a serious threat to not only continuing the progress, but even maintaining the gains that have been made by companies together with investors, NGOs, and the US government over the years. And those threats really are apparent both on the geopolitical stage, and I have to say, unfortunately, also on the domestic political stage here in the United States. And it became apparent to the center and to me and to others immediately after the presidential election in November 2024 that there was a severe challenge to maintaining this progress. And we've seen this on other fronts, on climate, on diversity, but an acute challenge to maintaining progress in business and human rights, hence this initiative undertaken by the center that Chloe is so capably leading.
And Chloe, when we deal with reports on this podcast, it's sometimes difficult to do justice to the depth of them. So can you begin by giving us a sort of high-level overview of what are the findings that have been produced?
Sure. Yes. Okay. So we started with this question. How are top US companies responding to all of the pressure out there, all of the anti-ESG, anti-rights pressure when it comes very specifically to human rights? And we did a few things. We did expert interviews. We talked to some of the companies that we're tracking. We did desk research. We also conducted a couple of surveys, which I'm sure we'll have time to get into. But here's what we found. We found evidence of 3 broad responses from US corporations to today's context. You know, you can call this, if you want, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think, Bennett, that was a you-ism, which I think is a helpful framing here. Because here's the good. Let me tell you the good. On the one hand, we have many companies holding firm despite the pressure. They're maintaining their commitments. They're maintaining their teams. They're staying the course. Here's the bad. The bad is that some are very quietly retreating from human rights, reducing teams. We're not seeing tons of policy change, but we're seeing some reduction in effort, in scope, in teams, in budget, in initiatives. And then here's the ugly. We see evidence of some companies very actively, very vocally taking actions, lobbying in ways that are undermining kind of human rights progress. And we make the case that this, it's a mixed picture. There is some kind of reason to be hopeful and optimistic, but it's also a real cause for concern. For rights holders, first and foremost. But as we try to make the case in the report, it's not good for business either to roll back on human rights.
And that point, the good, let's start with the good. In 8 of 13 companies who responded to you, where you did detailed analysis of those responses, in terms of companies continuing to report, in terms of what other benchmarks say, in terms of shareholder votes, you present a lot of evidence in this report that say that many companies are maintaining their stance. And that reflects certainly some research I did myself on US corporates last year. So it's wishful thinking. We want that to be the case here for those of us that are involved in business and human rights. What's behind that, and what gives you optimism when you have done this work?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. And I like starting with the hopeful. Okay, so here are a few things that we looked at. We looked at a range of different benchmarks and human rights rankings that came out in early 2026. So Know the Chain, we did an update. Corporate Human Rights Benchmark came out with an update. World Benchmarking Alliance social indicators have a lot of human rights kind of core indicators in there. The Lead the Charge leaderboard looking at auto companies. And we looked at the human rights dimensions of these benchmarks. And we found that by and large, the companies assessed were kind of maintaining their policy commitments. Although the data cutoff was in 2025, so we haven't done a 2026 review yet, but as of 2025, this is the picture that we're seeing on the policy commitment front. And then we did these surveys, and we surveyed the 54 companies that we are closely focused on through this initiative. About 25% responded, so the 13. And 8 of those companies indicated that they're either maintaining the size of their teams or in some cases even increasing their human rights team size. And this is encouraging. These companies are showing us that corporate respect for human rights is possible in today's context.
Bennett, when this research was looked at in November, there were even more companies maintaining their human rights policies and commitments. But this latest research is beginning to peel away. So literally the last 6 months, can you detect why that might be happening?
Yeah. So the initial research and the findings issued in mid-November painted a largely positive picture of companies mostly maintaining their longstanding policy commitments related to human rights. And this time, the approach has been, I think, a little more sophisticated, just given the greater capability now to undertake the research, the greater time to really drill down on capacity. And, for all of the importance of policy commitments, and I say this as somebody who's been in the policy commitment and standard setting business for a quarter century related to human rights, it's great, but it's not good enough if there's not a capacity to implement the commitments. Frankly, the policies are worthless. They're useless if the implementation capacity is cut or let alone gutted. So that's the one of the sharp findings in this new round here. And I just want to emphasize also part of the intent. Part of the intent here is to encourage companies to stay the course and to recognize that so many of these 54 companies and so many others have been truly committed and dedicated, even if their performance has been inconsistent at times, but committed to respect human rights. They put the policies in place. They've deployed the teams. So the effort here is to encourage those companies to stay the course. And frankly, the flip side is discourage and deter them from walking away. And I would just add, and we can maybe get into this more later in the conversation, that while this is essentially about encouraging responsibility, these findings can also provide a baseline for accountability for civil society organizations to hold companies accountable if, in fact, The research demonstrates that they're gutting the implementation capacity, let alone undermining progress overall.
I want to get onto some of the broader context of this, but there's also some very sharp commentary in the report that I don't want to overlook. First, Chloe, you criticise lobbying undertaken by what you call big oil. What's your criticism?
Yeah, so kind of we have a section on big oil. So we call out kind of big oil and big tech as being two industries, two sets of companies that we see in this following this pathway of kind of undermining human rights progress. So when it comes to big oil, and here what we're doing is we are really amplifying the wonderful research done by others. So of course, SOMO came out I think late last year, late 2025, with some findings that a coalition of 11 fossil fuel companies, a lot of them US based, had been lobbying heavily to weaken the CSDDD. Then you have some really excellent work done by organizations like Earthrights, looking into the role of fossil fuel companies lobbying here in the US. You have that at both the federal level and the state level. And literally, you can look at some of the bills that kind of the industry is pushing in the US, and it's some of the language is literally lifted from the American Petroleum Institute policy plan. Like, this is a powerful industry right now, really kind of taking advantage of this moment, this context to push this deregulatory agenda. And what that is leading to is closing civil space. They're trying to make it harder for people to protest, to criticize projects. They're trying to get immunity from climate liability lawsuits, and the list goes on.
And that immunity from climate liability passed in Utah, Tennessee, Oklahoma, and Iowa. I don't think that's widely known enough across the world. Slightly frightening, I have to say, from any sort of climate perspective. You also specifically cite Energy Transfer's lawsuit against Greenpeace. Once again, I don't remember which of you, please explain what was happening there.
Yeah, I can address that, having been involved in recent months with Greenpeace US and Greenpeace International in making the case against these awful SLAPP suits, of which this energy transfer suit against Greenpeace is a leading example. We've seen in Europe and in the US and to some extent else in other countries efforts by companies to silence critics, particularly environmental and human rights NGOs, sometimes individual environmental or human rights defenders, through these strategic litigation, so-called strategic litigation lawsuits. And the single most notorious of those lawsuits right now is this energy transfer lawsuit, falsely accusing Greenpeace of fomenting, instigating the protests that briefly shut down construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, I believe in 2016. That's in the Great Plains state of North Dakota. So Greenpeace has been vigorously fighting in the courts, both in North Dakota, but also in the Netherlands. And I spoke at a Greenpeace International event in Amsterdam in April to make the case, along with others from Greenpeace and other NGOs, that how insidious these suits are, and that companies that bring them need to be held to account, along with the law firms that work with the companies. You know, we should all have the ability to express our views, positive, negative, critical, and otherwise. And companies need to be able to live with critics around the world. This is, how the world should work is we have a free exchange of ideas and not try to silence each other. So Greenpeace is really at the tip of the spear here with this case, and it's going to play out over the coming months.
And led to a 345 million US dollar fine. If there's strategic lawsuits against public participation, I can't think of anything that would more prevent public participation than the fear of getting
Exactly.
multi-million pound fines.
Exactly.
Sorry, again, it's not all bad. In the report, you commend the position taken by companies in relation to the conduct of the ICE immigration officials in Minnesota and the violent scenes we all saw there. Just tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is one of the examples that we draw on for showing that companies can and have been at least tentatively speaking out in defense of some of these kind of broader principles around rights and democracy and rule of law. 60 chief executives of Minnesota-based companies, so that's companies including Target, Cargill, many others, big ones here in the US, through the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, came out with a letter following the shooting of Alex Preddy by a U.S. federal agent, um, calling for an immediate de-escalation of tensions. And, this letter has been criticized by many as not going far enough. And to be sure, other organizations like the American Sustainability Business Network has gone much further, talking about how silence is not neutral on these kind of issues. And we need more companies taking those kind of bigger, bolder steps and kind of even more explicitly calling for kind of full withdrawals of ICE, for instance. But I think what is notable and what is hopeful about this letter signed by these 60 chief executive officers is, it's something, it's a step. And we're in a really challenging context where a lot of companies, like I go out and I talk to these companies and they're just putting their heads down. They're not talking about this stuff publicly. They don't want a target on their back. So the fact that you had this action, I think, is
Yeah.
notable, even if it wasn't far enough.
If I could add here to Chloe's good points, that while that statement was weak in some respects, it was significant insofar as there were over half a dozen of the largest companies in corporate America among the signatories. The Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Twin Cities of Minnesota have some of the major corporate headquarters in the country. So it was notable in that respect. Yet it's also important to note that not just on human rights issues, but more broadly, rule of law and constitutional democracy, that corporate America has been largely silent in the first 17 months now of this second Trump term, in a notable contrast to the situation immediately before and after the 2020 presidential election, when the Business Roundtable, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and the National Association of Manufacturers, about 10 days, 12 days before the election in early November 2020, issued a joint statement calling for peaceful transfer of power, anticipating or fearing something like January 6, 2021. And then finally, and it's just extraordinary to reflect back now, given the current political climate and the relative silence of corporate America, that on the evening of January 6, 2021, the National Association of Manufacturers issued a public statement calling on then Vice President Pence to convene the cabinet, invoke the 25th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, and remove the then still current occupant of the Oval Office from office for the final 2 weeks of the term. Extraordinary in retrospect. And I don't want to get much beyond our remit here of business and human rights, but we may have some testing times in connection with the midterm congressional elections in early November, and again, the presidential election in 2028. But the point here is that business respect for human rights ultimately relates directly to respect for rule of law and constitutional democracy. And that's beyond the mandate of the center in this specific report, but these issues do and responsibilities all join up at some point.
I wanted to come on to ask this next now, the big picture. In this podcast, and you know this as a past guest, we've periodically looked at the so-called ESG backlash in the United States, and we've drawn together people from business and investment and from NGOs to discuss strategies to respond to that and to put the case for sustainability and to maintain the progress as you're talking about in this initiative. How would you say the position is now on the ESG backlash and how that might best be countered?
Maybe I'll address it first because I was senior vice president of Calvert Investments from 2006 to 15. So in the middle of the whole responsible investment and ESG world in the U.S. I think that this backlash, which became increasingly apparent in calendar year 2022, although there was some uh, uh, build up before that, it's built ever since. I'd like to think, I'm not certain, but I'd like to think that it's peaked. That we now are also seeing a pushback against the backlash against ESG. There was a notable development just recently. A group of Republican members of the House of Representatives, including a North Carolina Congressman, Pat Harrigan, issued a letter calling for investors to be able to make their own choices as to how they assess risks. And without using the acronym ESG, the whole intent was very clear that investors who think that there are environmental, social, and governance factors to be considered in the investment, research, and decision-making process should be permitted to do so and not shut down, as some states and unfortunately public pension funds, fiduciaries in some of the states have tried to do. So that was a hopeful sign. I think, and maybe, I'm too much of a eternal optimist, even amidst some of the nasty realities that we're facing in the U.S. these days. But I would like to think that both in the U.S. and across the Atlantic and abroad, that the ESG agenda, which I define narrowly in terms of investors' concerns, but it's an acronym that has become something of a proxy for broader corporate responsibility and sustainability. I'd like to think that this agenda is going to be resilient. I think it will be. As the climate crisis intensifies, as we feel is felt around the world, and as human rights risks and responsibilities, frankly, not just continue but intensify, and diversity challenges and opportunities persist as well. So I'm hopeful that this backlash has peaked. I'm hopeful that the backlash against the backlash is going to gain some momentum, and I'm heartened that there's some bipartisan, including Republican support for investor choice to decide which factors they believe are most salient and at times material.
Yeah, they called it the freedom to invest, and it's clearly not a liberal or a left of centre position, but in this instance is the sign of something changing. Also, was struck by the Wall Street Journal coming out in favour of ESG investment, and that wouldn't be normally where you would hear those arguments from.
Right.
Chloe, Business and Human Rights Centre is not a campaigning organisation. You're a platform where business and human rights issues are investigated and responded to by companies. But there is a dilemma for US corporates at the moment, because they've got Europe saying to them, you've got to conduct human rights due diligence before too long and publish what you've done, and you'll be penalised if you won't. And you've got lots of pressure in the US from the US authorities saying don't comply with the European law, and if you do, we'll penalise you. So it's like damned if you do and damned if you don't. What on earth advice could you give to companies when you hear that?
Yeah, the first time I was asked this question, I was presenting to a group of apparel companies on the work that we were doing, and one raised their hand, and it was just after several U.S. States attorneys generals had sent a letter to some top U.S. companies urging them not to comply. And they're like, so what do we do? And, I'm going to make Bennett answer this question because I think he probably has a much better response than I do. But I would just say that there are more durable counterforces out there in the world driving respect for
Right.
rights, insisting on respect for rights. And that's regulatory advancements, not just in Europe, but elsewhere in the world. That's, there's been some real kind of landmark court and jury
Yeah.
rulings in the past several months. The social license to operate isn't going away. The demands from investors, as you were just speaking
Yeah.
about, So, this stuff still exists despite this pressure.
Exactly, and let's just take up the social license to operate. It sounds like an abstract phrase. It is about as tangible and material as it gets when it happens. Knows the story well, having over 3 decades now finally exited the Niger Delta region of Nigeria in the face of intermittent and at times intense pressure from local communities, opposition to human rights abuses, environmental pollution, and so forth. There is a growing business case, not just a moral or ethical case, but a business case and frankly, a political case for companies to take very, very seriously these risks and responsibilities and to understand that while the political winds have been blowing in one direction, particularly in the US the last 16 or 18 months, that the winds will change, but the climate will remain broadly the same with these pressures. And there are pressures from different sides, not just in the US, from around the world. And American multinationals need to be smart enough and responsible enough to understand that they have to face a range of pressures from governments, from civil society, all around the world, not just in the US.
And I think specifically on the US versus the EU, I can see two scenarios. Perhaps things change and the backlash is diminished in the US, perhaps particularly after November, and it will all actually continue with a big phase-in period with lots of opportunity for US corporates to learn what they need to do. Or if the policies stay the same in the US, I would foresee deep political pressure on the European Union from the US, and I'm not sure the EU is strong enough to stand up to it. And so clearly I hope that won't be the position, but I won't be surprised if we're here in a year or two reflecting on that. Final question to each of you. Chloe, brilliant bit of research. Congratulations. What's next for the US Corporate Human Rights Index?
Yeah, thank you so much. So one of the pathways that we see companies taking, as I mentioned, is this idea of the silent retreat, kind of cutting staff, cutting teams, cutting budgets, withdrawing from initiatives like the Brazil soy moratorium, for instance, with agribusinesses pulling out via their Brazil Industry Association. So we're going to dig deeper into this silent retreat. Because I actually think that this is where a lot of damage is going to be done behind the scenes, and we want to shine a light on it to the degree possible. So that'll be our big focus. We'll also be updating our policy and commitment reviews of the 54 companies that we're tracking. So looking for any policy or commitment changes that these companies have made so far in 2026. Yeah, and we'll continue going from there, kind of monitoring actions, kind of figuring out kind of the different tactics companies are using to stay the course or to roll back.
All of your information is, of course, available online on the Business and Human Rights Centre's website, including individual profiles of the 54 companies. Bennett, last question to you. Chloe picked out those words from your report, that silence is not a neutral choice. You're a passionate business and human rights advocate. Just make the case for that.
That's exactly right. And I can't resist quoting, but elaborating very quickly on the words of really the father of the contemporary business human rights movement, somebody you and I, Richard, both knew and was inspired by, namely the late, great Sir Geoffrey Chandler, who passed away in 2011, but after a long career at Shell, founded the Amnesty UK Business and Human Rights Group in the mid-90s after the Shell Ken Saro-Wiwa debacle. And he was just so influential and inspirational in the field. And he made the business case for human rights as eloquently and persuasively as anybody. And yet one of his favorite sayings was, the hell with the business case, it's about doing the right thing. I believe that that's an article of faith for me. That's what's inspired me and so many hundreds of people I've worked with all around the world on business and human rights. But I think we're also at a moment where the business case is as or more important than ever, particularly in the domestic political environment in the U.S., the geopolitical overall situation that we're in with threats like AI and the issues around critical minerals. So the business case needs to be amplified. I hope it resonates. And again, the effort here is to encourage companies to stay the course, hold those who don't accountable. But we can't overlook the huge amount of work done by hundreds, thousands of people in these companies, not US, UK, European companies based all around the world on human rights, and to really encourage them to stay the course. And I just am very hopeful that this initiative of the center really builds awareness and reinforces commitment on the part of companies that yes, you're being watched, you're being researched, you're being tracked, but you're being encouraged. You're being encouraged and supported to continue and build on a quarter century of progress exactly now amidst these headwinds. So that's where I would land is yes, it's about doing the right thing, but this business case is absolutely critically important.
In this podcast, we've heard that the intent behind this new initiative is to deter companies from backtracking, to hold them to account, but as Bennett said in his last answer there, ultimately to encourage companies to build on the amazing progress there's been on business and human rights. We've heard from Chloe that the evidence shows that many companies are maintaining their human rights policies and commitments, but the real concern is that they are getting rid of their capacity to implement what they say they want them to do. We've heard some pretty striking criticisms of big oil and of tech companies for directly undermining, using their lobbying and litigation efforts to undermine business and human rights. And we've put it in the global context as well, and been told that this isn't just EU versus the USA, but business and human rights policies are sweeping the world, as are the demands for investors, as are the stakeholder groups, and that US companies probably understand that, even if US politicians may not. I'm so sorry that we've run out of time because this conversation could have gone on a lot longer. But to Chloe Cole and to Bennett Freeman, thank you so much for being our guests on Frankly Speaking today.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to be here.
Thank you, Richard. As always, just great to engage with you and your audience. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the Frank Bold podcast on responsible business. Find out more about Frank Bold's Responsible Companies section on our website, and please give us your feedback on our LinkedIn page or by commenting via your podcast provider, where we hope you will share the conversation and give this podcast a 5-star rating. And remember, you can watch us on our YouTube channel now too. Thank you again to Bennett, to Chloe, and to all of you for listening. Do join us next time, and goodbye.